Henry Cartwright was the kind of man people admired from afar. His life in New York was surrounded by luxury, power, and influence. At age 52, he owned a fortune that most people couldn't even imagine. But despite all the glamour and success, Henry felt empty. His heart was marked by a tragedy that over the years turned into a wound that never healed. 15 years ago, Henry had lost his wife Elizabeth and son James in a car accident. It was a rainy night, and the last thing he remembered was the call he received from the hospital. Elizabeth's car had skidded off the road and over a cliff. When Henry arrived at the hospital, he was told that his wife and son did not survive. That night changed his life forever. Since then, Henry has isolated himself from the world emotionally. Although he continued to expand his business and build an empire, his heart was in ruins. He avoided personal connections, and the mansion where he lived was cold and silent, like a mausoleum. Friends and co-workers knew not to bring up the subject of lost family. Henry took refuge in his work, where he could at least control the variables and avoid suffering. One afternoon, while leaving a meeting at a luxurious Manhattan hotel, Henry was approached by a little boy. The boy, who couldn't have been more than 7 years old, had dirty clothes and seemed nervous. "Sir, please, can you help me?" the boy begged, looking at Henry with eyes full of despair. Henry, used to brushing aside requests for help, was about to ignore him. But something in the boy's eyes made him stop. There was an unsettling familiarity in that expression, something he couldn't immediately identify. "What do you want, boy?" Henry asked, his voice harsher than he intended. "My mother. She is very sick and we need money for medicine. I don't know what to do," the boy replied, his voice breaking as he pulled an old wallet from his pocket. With a shaking hand, the boy opened his wallet and showed a photo. When Henry looked at the image, his heart stopped for an instant. It was a photo of a woman and a small boy. The woman in the photo was undeniably Elizabeth, his late wife, and the boy next to her was James, his son, but at an age when he never knew him. Henry felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. How was this possible? He was looking at a photograph that shouldn't exist. His mind was flooded with questions and painful memories. "Who is this woman?" Henry asked, his voice now shaky, holding the photo tighter than he intended. The boy looked at him, surprised by Henry's change in attitude. This is my mother, Elizabeth, and that's my brother, James. He died when I was a baby. She always carries this photo with her," the boy explained, confused by the man's behavior. Henry was silent, his mind racing in 1,000 different directions. What was this child saying? How could this photo exist if his wife and son were dead? And why was this boy here, asking for help? "Where is your mother now?" Henry asked, trying to control the whirlwind of emotions that dominated him. "At the hospital. I can take you there. Please, sir, she needs help," the boy begged again, with tears beginning to form in his eyes. Henry looked at the boy, not knowing what to think or how to act. The photo in his hand seemed to burn, carrying the weight of 15 years of grief and loneliness. Against all his rational defenses, he knew he needed to see this woman. Even if it was a mistake, a cruel illusion, he needed to understand what was happening. "Let's go then," Henry finally said, his voice firm, trying to hide the panic he felt. He handed the photo back to the boy and gestured for him to guide him. As they walked through the busy streets of New York, Henry felt that something profound and irrevocable was about to happen. The pain he had kept buried for so long was about to resurface, bringing with it truths he never expected to confront. Henry and the little boy, who he now knew was called Tommy, headed towards the hospital. Every step Henry took him deeper into a sea of confusing and painful emotions. The boy walked hurriedly, his small hand holding the wallet with the photo of Elizabeth and James, as if it were his most precious possession. As they crossed the streets of New York, Henry couldn't stop thinking about the impossibility of it all. Elizabeth and James were dead. He had seen the bodies, arranged the funeral, carried the weight of that loss for more than a decade. How could this child have the same photo he kept in a dusty memory album? How could this woman be the same Elizabeth he had loved and lost? Questions echoed in his mind, but he had no answers. When they arrived at the hospital, Henry felt a lump form in his throat. The place was small, clearly intended to serve people without many resources. Henry couldn't help but feel out of place here, with his expensive suit and imposing presence. However, He followed Tommy, who led him determinedly through the halls until they reached a room at the end of the hall. "It's here. My mother is here," said Tommy with a mixture of anxiety and hope in his voice. Henry paused for a moment before opening the door. He wasn't prepared for what he would find inside, but he knew he needed to see it for himself. He pushed the door and entered. The room was small and dimly lit, with a smell of disinfectant and sadness in the air. On the bed, a woman lay, hooked up to tubes and monitors, looking frail and pale. When Henry saw her face, his heart almost stopped. It was Elizabeth. Older, more tired, but undeniably Elizabeth. She opened her eyes at the sound of the door opening, and her eyes met Henry's. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The look of shock in her eyes mirrored his. But then, something strange happened. There was no recognition he expected. Instead, there was confusion, and then fear. "Who are you?" Elizabeth asked in a weak voice, almost a whisper. Henry lay still, unable to process what was happening. How could she not recognize him? He took a step forward, trying to find the right words. "Elizabeth, it's me, Henry. Henry Cartwright," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of hope and despair. But she just shook her head as if trying to understand what was happening. "No, it can't be," she murmured, closing her eyes as if she were trying to banish a painful memory. "Henry died. He died in that accident, along with James." Henry felt the world spin when he heard those words. She believed he was dead. That explained why she never came back to him. But it still didn't explain how she survived the accident, or how she ended up here, with a child she claimed to be her son. Tommy approached the bed, holding his mother's hand. He looked at Henry, confused. "He said he knew you, Mom. He seemed to know who James was too," Tommy said, trying to make sense of everything. Elizabeth opened her eyes again, looking at Henry with a pained expression. "You can't be him. But you look so much like him," she whispered, her voice full of confusion. Henry felt tears burn his eyes, but he held them back. "I needed to remain calm and understand what was happening. Elizabeth, I didn't die in that accident. I thought you two were dead," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I lived all these years thinking you were dead. How did this happen? Why didn't you ever come back to me?" She stared at him for a long moment before closing her eyes again, as if trying to remember something long buried. "After the accident, I woke up in a hospital with no memory. It took me months to remember who I was. But when I finally remembered, I was told that you and James had died. I ran away. I couldn't bear the idea of living without you," she explained, the words coming out with difficulty. Henry felt his heart sink when he heard her story. It all made sense now, but that didn't make things any easier. He looked at Tommy, who was silent, listening to the conversation. "And Tommy, how did he?" Henry started to ask, but was interrupted by Elizabeth. "Tommy is not your son, Henry," she said, her voice so soft he could barely hear it. "He is my son, but with another man after I thought you had died. I tried to move on, but I never could." Henry felt a whirlwind of emotions. The revelation shocked him deeply, but it also brought a kind of painful realization. Elizabeth had tried to rebuild her life, but her heart always belonged to the past. Silence settled in the room, heavy and full of unexpressed emotions. Henry realized that his presence there was causing pain to both him and Elizabeth, but he also knew he couldn't just walk away. "I'll do whatever it takes to help you," Henry said finally, his voice full of determination. "I can't change the past, but I can ensure that you have a better future." Elizabeth looked at him, her eyes full of tears. "I never wanted you to know. I never wanted you to go through this pain," she said. Henry approached the bed and held her hand, feeling the warmth he had craved for so long. He knew that despite everything, he still loved her. And that was a truth he couldn't ignore, even with all the confusion and suffering this discovery had brought. As they sat in silence, Henry realized that this was just the beginning of a long journey. He still needed to figure out how to live with these new truths, how to rebuild a relationship that had been torn apart by fate. In the days that followed, Henry found himself visiting the hospital every day, trying to process the revelations that had so unexpectedly transformed his life. With each visit, He sat next to Elizabeth, trying to understand what had happened to the woman he loved and what it meant for the future. Elizabeth, for her part, seemed to be trapped in an internal struggle. Although she was happy that Henry was alive, the guilt and pain over what happened in the intervening years kept her from opening up completely to him. There were so many things unsaid, so many feelings that they both tried to process. Tommy, on the other hand, was becoming more and more attached to Henry. The boy saw in him a father figure that he never had, and although Henry knew he was not his biological father, he felt a growing connection to the boy. He began to care deeply about Tommy's well-being, and this motivated him to make decisions he never imagined he would make. It was on one of these visits that Henry had a moment of clarity. He was sitting next to Elizabeth, watching her sleep, when something inside him changed. He realized that regardless of the past, what happened or what didn't happen, he wanted Elizabeth and Tommy to be a part of his life. He wanted to help them rebuild what was lost, even if the path was difficult. When Elizabeth woke up, Henry was holding her hand. She looked at him, and for the first time in a long time, she saw something different in Henry's eyes. A firm decision, a determination. "Elizabeth, I need you to come with me," Henry said, his voice soft but firm. Elizabeth looked at him, surprised. "Where to?" she asked, confused. "Home," he replied. "Come home with me, you and Tommy. I want to take care of you, help rebuild what was lost. I know it won't be easy, and I know the past is full of pain, but I believe we can find a way to move forward together." Elizabeth remained silent, surprised by the proposal. She never expected Henry to react like this. In fact, she hoped he would go away, leave her behind, carrying the pain of the past with him. But now he was here, offering her a second chance, something she never thought she would have. "Henry?" she began, but he interrupted her. "I know things are complicated, Elizabeth. I know you may be scared or confused, but I also know that I love you and always have. I want to be with you, with Tommy. I want us to be a family, even if it's not the family we once imagined. We can make this work, but we need to try," he said, his voice full of emotion. Elizabeth felt tears run down her face. For so long she had felt lost, not knowing where to go or what to do. And now Henry was there, offering her a path, a chance to start over. But she knew it wouldn't be easy. There were so many years of pain, so many wounds that needed to be healed. "I don't know if I can, Henry," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to face all of this." Henry squeezed her hand tighter. "You're stronger than you think, Elizabeth. And I will be by your side every step of the way. We can do this together," he said. Elizabeth looked at him for a long moment, trying to find the courage within herself. Finally, she nodded slightly, allowing hope to rise in her heart. "Okay, I'll try," she said, her voice still fragile but full of determination. Henry felt relief wash over him. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, full of challenges and old pains that would need to be faced. But he was determined to fight for this new chance, for this new family that was forming unexpectedly. With Henry's help, Elizabeth was transferred to a private clinic, where she could receive the treatment necessary for her recovery. Meanwhile, Henry began to reorganize his life to include Elizabeth and Tommy. He started making plans for the house, for the future, imagining a scenario in which they could be happy together. But things are never as simple as they seem. As Elizabeth began to improve physically, the ghosts of her past began to haunt her more intensely. She began having nightmares, reliving the accident and the years of loneliness that followed. And as a result, she began to move away from Henry, fearing that he would end up walking away when he saw the deep marks that those years had left on her. Henry noticed the change in Elizabeth but didn't know how to help her. He tried to get closer, but there was always a barrier, something that prevented them from connecting like before. And then one night, everything came to a breaking point. Elizabeth had a terrible nightmare, screaming as she relived the accident. Henry ran to her room, trying to calm her down. When she finally woke up, she was panicking, breathing hard. Henry held her, trying to comfort her, but she was in shock, unable to process what was happening. "Elizabeth, I'm here with you," Henry whispered, holding her tightly. But she was so lost in fear that she started pushing him away, trying to move away. "No, you don't understand. I can't live with this. I can't forget." she screamed, tears streaming down her face. Henry felt Elizabeth's despair as if it were his own. He knew she was fighting demons he couldn't see, but he didn't know how to help her face them. "Elizabeth, please don't give up on us. We need to fight this together," he pleaded, his voice full of pain. But Elizabeth was beyond the reach of his words. She curled up on the bed, shaking and crying as if she was trying to protect herself from the world. Henry felt helpless, not knowing what to do. He realized that no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't save Elizabeth alone. There were deep wounds inside her that needed to be healed, and he didn't know if he was equipped to do that. He only knew that he loved her, and that he would do everything in his power to help her find peace. That night, Henry made a choice. He knew he needed help to save Elizabeth, to save what was left of his family. And so, he decided to look for someone who could help, someone who could guide them on this difficult path of healing and reconciliation. Henry decided to see a therapist who specialized in trauma, someone who could help Elizabeth face her fears and the pain she had carried for so many years. And so, with this new decision, Henry took another step towards an uncertain but hopeful future. Henry knew that the decision to seek professional help was necessary. Despite all the resources he had, he understood that money could not buy the kind of healing Elizabeth needed. And deep down, he also knew that he would need to face his own ghosts, his own pain, if he wanted to help Elizabeth find peace. He found a respected therapist, Dr. Arthur Bennett, who was known for his work with victims of trauma and loss. When Henry met with the therapist for the first time, he was honest about the complexity of the situation. Dr. Bennett listened attentively, asking questions that helped Henry reflect on his own journey of pain and grief. After a long conversation, the therapist agreed to work with Elizabeth and eventually Henry and Tommy if necessary. Convincing Elizabeth to meet with the therapist was a challenge. She was reluctant to open her wounds to a stranger, fearing it would only make things worse. But Henry insisted, reminding her that he was there for her, willing to do whatever was necessary to help her find peace. "Elizabeth, you don't have to carry this weight alone. We can get through this together, but we need help," Henry said. Holding her hands firmly, Elizabeth finally relented. Although the idea of revisiting her trauma was scary, she knew she couldn't continue living in that state of constant terror and sadness. And so, she began meeting with Dr. Bennett. The first sessions were difficult. Elizabeth closed herself off, avoided talking about the past, and limited herself to answering the therapist's questions in a vague way. However, Dr. Bennett was patient and persistent, encouraging her to face her fears slowly, without rushing. Over time, Elizabeth began to open up. She talked about the accident, about the pain of waking up in a hospital with no memory, and then being told that her family was dead. She shared how, after recovering some of her memories, she tried to rebuild her life, but was never able to free herself from Henry and James's shadow. The therapist guided her through a process of understanding that the grief and trauma she was carrying needed to be addressed so she could move forward. As Elizabeth worked on her recovery, Henry also began attending sessions. He was confronted with his own buried emotions, the guilt of not having been there at the time of the accident, the void left by the loss of his family, and the complexity of reuniting with Elizabeth and Tommy years later. Henry realized that as much as he wanted to be the savior, he also needed to be saved. The group sessions were a turning point. Dr. Bennett brought Henry, Elizabeth, and Tommy together, creating a safe space for everyone to express their feelings. For Tommy, it was a chance to better understand what was happening to his mother and to share his own pain and fear. The boy, who has always been resilient, began to open up about his insecurities and how he feared losing his mother, just like he lost his brother. It was in one of these sessions that Elizabeth was finally able to express something she had been repressing for years. "I feel like I failed you all," Elizabeth said with tears in her eyes. "I failed Henry by not being able to find a way back to him. I failed Tommy by not being the mother he deserves. And I failed myself for never finding the strength to overcome this pain." Henry, who was sitting next to her, reached out and held her hand. "You did not fail, Elizabeth. None of us knew how to deal with all of this. We are all learning together. And that's what matters now," he said, his voice full of sincerity. Tommy, with his big innocent eyes, looked at his mother. "I just want you to be okay, Mommy. It doesn't matter what happened before, I just want us to be together," he said with a maturity that surprised everyone. These words touched Elizabeth deeply. She realized that despite all her perceived flaws, there was still hope. There was still a chance to be the mother, the partner, and the person she wanted to be. The healing process was long and full of ups and downs. There were days when Elizabeth felt strong and hopeful, and others when the weight of the past threatened to pull her back into the darkness. But with the support of Henry, Tommy, and Dr. Bennett, she began to build a new sense of identity, a new strength. Henry also underwent a transformation. He began to allow himself to feel and express his emotions, something he had avoided for years. The pain he had bottled up finally began to dissipate as he connected more deeply with Elizabeth and Tommy. As the months passed, Elizabeth began to feel more secure in her new life. Therapy sessions continued, but now they were more about building a future together than reliving the painful past. Henry and Elizabeth began to make plans for the future, considering the possibility of moving to a house in a quieter place where they could start a new life as a family. Tommy also flourished in this new environment. He began attending a better school, where he made new friends and began to feel more confident and secure. Henry became a father figure to him, and the two developed a strong and genuine bond. Despite all the progress, Henry knew the journey was far from over. He still had doubts and fears about the future, especially about how the scars of the past could impact what they were trying to build. But he also knew that together they had overcome their darkest times and that with patience and love, they could continue to grow and heal. As he watched Elizabeth and Tommy playing in the garden of the new house they bought outside of town, Henry felt a deep sense of peace that he hadn't experienced in years. He knew that life was unpredictable and that he could still face challenges. But for the first time in a long time, he also knew that he was where he needed to be, with the people he loved. Henry, Elizabeth, and Tommy's new life was unfolding in a quiet town on the outskirts of New York. The house Henry bought for them was spacious and comfortable, surrounded by trees and with a beautiful garden that quickly became Tommy's favorite place to play. The time spent in the new residence allowed the family to continue to heal and make new memories. However, as often happens in life, the hard-won peace was about to be shattered by an unexpected revelation. And that revelation would come one cold autumn night, when an unexpected visit to Henry's door brought the past to the surface in a way no one could have predicted. It was a Friday night and the family was gathered in the living room watching a movie. Tommy's laughter echoed through the house, and Elizabeth, now healthier and happier, held Henry's hand as they watched the screen. Everything seemed perfect, until the doorbell rang, interrupting the moment. "Who will it be at this time?" Henry asked, getting up to answer the door. When he opened the door, he found a tall, thin man with piercing eyes and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The man wore a dark coat, and there was something about his posture that made Henry's instincts spark. "Can I help?" Henry asked cautiously. The man extended his hand in a cold greeting. "Mr. Cartwright? My name is David Harlan. I think we have something to discuss," he said, his voice filled with an unsettling calm. Henry frowned, trying to remember if he knew this man, but he couldn't place it. Something about the way David looked at him made Henry feel uncomfortable. "I don't remember meeting you before, Mr. Harlan. What is it about?" Henry asked, keeping the door just ajar. David smiled enigmatically. "I think it's best to discuss this in private. It involves your family and the past you think you know." Henry's heart quickened. He didn't like the man's tone, but something compelled him to let him in. Perhaps it was the desire to protect his family or curiosity about what he might know. "He is well. We can talk here in the office, said Henry, leading him to a room further away from the room. When they sat down in the office, David took an envelope out of his pocket and placed it on the table. Henry looked at the envelope, feeling a knot forming in his stomach. "What is that?" Henry asked hesitantly. "Evidence that what you think happened to your wife and son, Elizabeth and James, is not the whole truth," David replied, his eyes fixed on Henry. Henry felt his blood run cold. He reached out and opened the envelope, pulling out a series of photos and documents. As he examined the contents, his heart began to beat faster. The photos showed Elizabeth and James, but they also showed an unknown man standing next to them on several occasions in different places. "Who is this man?" Henry asked, feeling anger begin to bubble inside him. David crossed his arms as if relishing the tension in the air. That man, Mr. Cartwright, was your wife's lover before and after the accident. What you didn't know is that Elizabeth was in a relationship with him when the accident happened. And James, well, there's a chance he wasn't your biological son. David's words hit Henry like a punch in the gut. He looked at the photos, feeling betrayed and confused. What David was saying was impossible, but the proof was right there in front of his eyes. This can't be true. Elizabeth would never do that, Henry stammered. But his voice was weak, lacking conviction. David shrugged. The truth, Mr. Cartwright, is that sometimes people do things we would never imagine. Maybe Elizabeth loved you, but it seems like she had her secrets too. And you deserve to know the truth, don't you think? Henry felt the room spin. Everything he thought he knew about his past, about Elizabeth and James, was crumbling before him. How could he deal with this? How could I face Elizabeth and Tommy knowing something like that? Why are you telling me this? Henry asked, trying to regain control. David watched him for a moment before responding. Because I believed you should know. The truth always comes out, Mr. Cartwright, and perhaps it's best that you figure this out on your own before something worse happens. Henry realized that David wasn't just there to inform him. There was something more, something he hadn't yet revealed. What do you want from me? Henry asked, his voice hardening. David smiled, but it was a cold, calculated smile. I want you to stay out of this, Mr. Cartwright. May you continue with your life, but without interfering with what is to come. If you do this, perhaps your family will remain intact. But if you try to stop it, the implied threat hung in the air. Henry felt the anger turning into something darker, something he could barely control. Are you threatening me? Henry asked, standing up, his body shaking with emotion. David kept his gaze fixed on Henry without looking away. I'm giving you a choice, and believe me, Mr. Cartwright, I always keep my promises. Henry wanted to advance on David, wanted to demand answers, but something stopped him. He knew that to protect Elizabeth and Tommy, he would need to act cautiously. But I also knew I couldn't let that man get away with it. Get out of my house, Henry said, his voice cool and controlled. David stood up, still with that enigmatic smile. As you wish, Mr. Cartwright. But remember what we talked about. Sometimes the truth is more dangerous than any lie. And with those words, he was gone, leaving Henry alone with the photos and the doubts that now threatened to destroy everything he had rebuilt. Henry sat there in the office for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. The world he thought he was so carefully rebuilding was, once again, on the brink of collapse. When he finally returned to the room, Elizabeth and Tommy were waiting for him, laughing at something in the movie. But to Henry, their laughter sounded distant, as if it came from another reality. He knew he would need to confront Elizabeth about the photos, about what David had revealed. But how could he do this without destroying what little they had managed to rebuild? And more importantly, how could he protect his family from an enemy who seemed to know all of their secrets? The mood at Henry's house changed drastically after David Harlan's visit. Although Henry tried to hide his anxiety, Elizabeth noticed something was wrong. He was more distant, thoughtful, as if he were carrying an invisible weight. However, she didn't press. The fear that any argument could destabilize the fragile peace they had built prevented her from confronting him immediately. Days passed and Henry's tension grew. He knew he needed to find out the truth, but he didn't know how to approach Elizabeth without hurting her or putting Tommy in danger. David's words echoed in his mind. Sometimes the truth is more dangerous than any lie. One night, Henry decided he couldn't wait any longer. He needed to confront Elizabeth about the photos and the man who, according to David, was part of her past. While Tommy slept, Henry went to the room where Elizabeth was sitting on the bed, reading a book. When he entered, she looked up, surprised by the grim expression on his face. "Henry, what there was?" Elizabeth asked, closing the book and setting it aside. Henry sat on the edge of the bed, the envelope of photos in hand. He hesitated for a moment, looking at Elizabeth, trying to find the right words. "Elizabeth, I need you to tell me the truth," he began, his voice low but full of emotion. Elizabeth frowned, confused. "What are you talking about?" she asked, trying to read the expression on his face. Henry took a deep breath and slowly opened the envelope, taking out the photos that David had left. He placed them on the bed in front of Elizabeth. She looked at the photos, and as she recognized the images, her face turned pale. "Who is this man, Elizabeth?" Henry asked, trying to control the anger and pain in his voice. Elizabeth took the photos with shaking hands, her eyes filling with tears. She recognized the images, but the shock of seeing them there, of knowing that Henry had discovered them, left her speechless for a moment. "Henry, I can explain," she said, her voice breaking. "Then explain," Henry insisted, his heart pounding. "Who is he? And why was he so close to you and James?" Elizabeth put the photos down, tears streaming down her face. "His name is Michael. We met shortly before the accident. I was confused, lost. Michael was a kind of escape, something that made me feel alive at a time when I felt dead inside." She began to explain, her voice shaking. Henry felt his heart sink when he heard those words, but he let her continue. "I never wanted to betray you, Henry. It was a mistake. When the accident happened, I was walking away, leaving Michael behind. I wanted to fix things between us, but then everything fell apart," Elizabeth said, her face contorted in pain. Henry was silent, processing her words. Part of him wanted to understand, wanted to forgive, but another part was destroyed by the pain of betrayal. "And James?" Henry asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is he my son?" Elizabeth sobbed, shaking her head. "Yes, Henry. James has always been your son. I never doubted that," she said with sincerity in her voice. Henry felt a rush of relief upon hearing this, but the pain of betrayal was still there, throbbing like an open wound. "And now, Elizabeth? Why did this man come back? What does he want from us?" Henry asked, trying to understand what was at stake. Elizabeth looked scared. "I don't know. I had no idea he was nearby or that he knew where we were. Michael has always been unstable. He may be trying to get revenge for something, or simply cause trouble. I don't know what to do," she admitted, desperate. Henry closed his eyes, feeling his anger turn to determination. He knew he couldn't let this man destroy what was left of his family. "Let's deal with this together, Elizabeth, but we need to be strong. I won't let anyone separate us again," Henry said, holding her hand firmly. Elizabeth nodded, feeling a ray of hope grow amidst the chaos. For the first time, they were facing the past together, without secrets. And that, after all, was a start. The next morning, Henry decided to act. He contacted a trusted private investigator, someone who could find out more about David Harlan and Michael. He needed to know who he was dealing with, what their intentions were, and how he could protect Elizabeth and Tommy. While the investigator worked, Henry and Elizabeth focused on creating a safe environment for Tommy, preventing him from noticing the tension surrounding them. However, they knew that time was running out. Something big was about to happen, and they needed to be prepared. Days later, the investigator returned with information that left Henry even more uneasy. Michael was in town, but his whereabouts were uncertain. He had been involved in suspicious activity and appeared to be looking for Elizabeth. As for David Harlan, it turned out that he was an accomplice of Michael, an unscrupulous man, willing to do anything for money. With this information, Henry and Elizabeth decided to act before Michael and David could make their next move. They planned a sudden trip, a temporary escape to safety, while Henry used his resources to deal with the threat once and for all. On the night of departure, while they were packing their bags, Tommy entered his parents' room, holding one of the toys he always took with him. He looked at Henry and Elizabeth, noticing the seriousness on their faces. "Where are we going?" Tommy asked with a touch of curiosity and concern in his voice. Henry knelt down beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Let's go on a little trip, Tommy. Just for a few days, but you'll like it, I promise," Henry said, trying to keep his tone light. Tommy nodded, trusting Henry's words. But he knew there was something more behind those words. He could feel the tension in the air, even though his parents tried to hide it. As the family left the house and got into the car, Henry looked at Elizabeth, who was sitting next to him. She was visibly nervous but determined. Henry knew that no matter what happened, they would face it together. As they drove out of the city toward a safe destination, Henry felt a sense of relief. They had taken the initiative. They were in control of the situation, at least for now. However, deep down he knew that the real test was yet to come. What they didn't know was that despite all their efforts, Michael and David were closer than they imagined. And the final battle, which would decide the future of this family, was about to happen in an unexpected and surprising way. Months have passed since that night when Henry, Elizabeth, and Tommy left their home in search of safety. The tension and fear that dominated their lives during that period began to disappear, giving way to a new normality. Henry used all of his power and influence to ensure that Michael and David were stopped before they could do any more damage. The final confrontation between Henry and his enemies did not turn out as he had imagined. There were no big battles or cinematic chases. Instead, it was a game of wits and patience. With the help of the private investigator and the police, Michael and David were captured and brought to justice. The threat that loomed over the Cartwright family has finally disappeared. Now, on a sunny spring morning, Henry found himself in a place that had become very special to him. The garden of his new home, where Tommy was playing happily among the flowers and trees. Elizabeth, sitting in a nearby chair, watched her son with a serene smile on her face, something Henry hadn't seen from her in many years. Despite everything they faced, the family was stronger and more united than ever. The process of healing and overcoming was long and painful, but Henry knew that each painful step was necessary to get to this point. He approached Elizabeth, sitting next to her and holding her hand. She looked at him, and in that moment, without needing words, they both knew they had found something precious. True peace. "I think we're finally home, don't you?" Henry said, his voice soft. Elizabeth nodded, squeezing his hand. "Yes, we are. And that's all that matters now," she replied with a smile that carried all the pain, resilience, and hope they had experienced. As the sun shone down on them, illuminating the garden, and Tommy's laughter filled the air, Henry knew that although the past could never be completely forgotten, they had managed to build something new, something worth protecting. And in that moment, he made a silent promise to himself. He would protect his family no matter what. Because at the end of the day, what really matters is who you choose to have by your side in life's battles.